going on, my friends? This is Rick, and this is your seat at the table. And I hope you're all having a great Labor Day weekend. It is very dry here. The humidity is low, and the temperature is actually down in the 70s, which makes it really unusual for early September in Iowa. And we are on the verge of a drought, or in some aspects are in a drought, and we could take a little bit more rain, right? But anyhow, we're going to do a couple videos today. A while back I did some on Arnor and why it failed, various elements within Arnor, and I think I'm going to do a small series here on Gondor next, starting with why Gondor succeeded, and we're going to take Gondor up to the end of the Sea Kings, because in the years and the decades and centuries after the Sea Kings, roughly, what is it, Third Age, I had 1149 or something like that, maybe not quite. Right before the Kinstrife anyway breaks out, that Gondor starts to slowly decline in its preeminent place as one of the largest, most successful human civilizations in Western Middle Earth. I think it's just not being quite fair to declare it is the pinnacle of human advancement in after Nuremberg falls across the entirety of Middle Earth, because let's be honest, there are some quite robust civilizations to the far east and south, and it's just typical human mindset to say we're better than everybody else, which is in part what happens to the Gondor as well as Arnor later down the road. We know that after the fall of Nuremberg takes place, Eladil and his sons Isidore and Arnorian lead a small fleet of faithful from the wreck of the island to Middle Earth and settle in both Gondor and in Arnor. Arnorian is initially considered the first king of Gondor, although there's a lot of suggestions that Isidore is as well. Him and his brother, Arnorian being the younger brother, shared the throne, while their father was the High King. Once they set up their affairs in Gondor, Elendil heads to Arnor, where he's going to rule ideally over both kingdoms from there. Looking at Gondor specifically, a larger number of Numerians settled in the region that would become Gondor. So in the years and centuries before the fall of Numenor, the various families and adventurers and sundry colonists, if you will, settled the Middle Earth in many different locations across Middle Earth. They established enclaves and small, let's not call them kingdoms, but they established themselves. And this includes Gondor and the region around the mouth of the Anduin. And in part because they want to keep an eye on Mordor and Sauron's old stomping ground, and in part because the area is just excellent for settling. It's temperate land. It's not uncommon or unreasonable to say it's similar to the Mediterranean in its climates and its ability for growing crops and access to the sea. So there's lots and lots of things to give an advantage to anybody settling within this region of Middle Earth, as opposed to Arnor. Arnor is much further north, as we've discussed, much harsher environment climate-wise, much more isolated from the world of men, which also plays a big role in the difference between the two kingdoms, in my opinion, right? And these are just my opinions and my observations. Now, I would call myself an amateur scholar of all things Tolkien. I have been an advocate and a consummate consumer of his material and his son's material and anything else that came out in all the years of my life. I discovered this when I was in my early teens, and once I discovered The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, it was off to the races. So I've got a feeling, in my opinion, on. And this is what this is always about. So, as you well know, I have a tendency to ramble, and I apologize for that. I am not a professional orator or a professional whatever you want to call it. This is never going to be. It's just my choice and wish to get my 2 cents worth out there and encourage other people to do the same thing and to, respond, click, like, hate, comment, what have you, right? Whatever we look at, it's not likely that uh, YouTube's going to anytime soon flag me as a popular stopover place. So when we look at the initial before the fall of Normandy and the region, Peleaguer as a port was already established. I know it was been around quite a while. I'd have to go dig around to get an exact date. But Peleaguer, which we don't see any, it's not in the movies, and it's very, very, very briefly mentioned in the books, I believe. And I think that's just because it's in one of the appendixes in the back. It's not part of the story of the War of the Ring itself directly. But what we don't understand is Peleaguer is a city on equal standing size-wise is Osgiliath, or minus, or even supersedes minus Arnor when it comes to the sheer number of people who live in and around that vicinity. It's also a crucial location because it controls the mouth of the Anduin. It is the premier fortress and logistics center for Gondor's fleet, for its naval tradition, and it plays a huge role. It's also one of the reasons why uh, the armies that are gathered at Gondor for the Battle of the Pelennor Fields are so thin, in part because Gondor has to defend its southern borders, because it is said in the books that a army come up out of the Harridan, and Easterling army came up out of the south and would have bypassed Peleaguer and marched on Osgiliath and joined the battle at Gondor had Gondor's forces not engaged them in the south. This in part is why it's also Peleaguer is also the choke point for Umbar ships. The Corsairs would have just sailed right up the river and joined the siege and the sack of Minas Arnor had there not been somebody here to put a stop to that. So in the novels, in the story, this is where Aragon, who goes by the way of the path of the dead, and forces the Oathbreakers to uphold their oath, and it's with this ghost army that he relieves these pressures on the southern boundaries of Gondor, freeing up a large contingent of men to march north to join in. By the time they get there, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is over, but it's these men that in part join the army that marches on the Black Gate, but also allows Gondor to reinforce crucial locations in the north, militarily speaking, leaving them garrisoned far more better off than they were prior to the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And if you're familiar with this, then you know what I'm talking about. So we don't actually see Peleaguer, but Peleaguer was well established, a very large place, a great base of operations for a would-be refugee king or self-proclaimed king, because you got to take into account we don't talk about this too often, but Eladel was not a king. He was related to the king of Nuremberg, but not in such a position that he would have been the direct, he would have been, he wasn't next in line of Nuremberg. There was others, even if he would have taken that position. So when he came to Middle Earth, he's the last of the Numerian bloodlines, Kling's bloodline, to escape the downfall. This isn't to say that there are not other elements and branches of the same bloodline scattered across Middle Earth, because it's implied in other places that this is true. This is so. It's just Eladale has the strongest claim, and it's because of the Numerians that are already settled in Gondor as colonists long before the fall of Nuremberg itself, are readily acceptant of his claim as kingship, that gives him the major toehold he requires to establish both Arnor and Gondor as kingdoms, and to give his 2 sons a legitimacy towards being his heirs to the High King of Arnor and Gondor. It's the same claim that the Numerians of Umbar and other places south and east, for the most part, don't accept. And this is what starts this concept of the Black Numerians versus the rest of them. So these people did not accept uh, Elendil's claim, and this starts many centuries of conflict between the descendants of Numer, spread out across the greater planet. So Pelegri is already established at 12 built. It gives him a base of operations. It allows them to set the stones that will become Asgiliath as a city. As cities go, and I'm not going to get into a tangent on all this stuff, but if you look at how Asgiliath is built, this is not a fortress city. You can make the argument that the part in the island in the center of the great river is definitely fortified and defensible, but it's yet at the same time, it's never been meant to be a fortress city. It's supposed to be a grand capital of the southern of Gondor proper and of the Numerians in exile overall. So these great bridges are built across the river. They're not designed to be cast down easily. They're not drawbridges from any indication. These are very vast structures and very intricate. So the fact is, this city was never intended to be a fortress. This is one of the reasons why you have the Tower of the Sun and the Tower of the Moon built in the vicinity to provide fortresses. They are built as fortresses as best they can be. Although my belief is that minus Arnor, minus Ithil, excuse me, was kind of placed in a very bad spot to begin with. Even if its first intention and most prominent purpose was to protect the back door, if you will, to Mordor, and to provide resources and manpower and stuff for watching Mordor proper. So when the faithful chose Gondor over Arnor, most likely had a different mindset from the beginning. I discussed that in my earlier version on Arnor, that I believe that the uber faithful, followed Elendil to the north to establish Arnor. These are the people who are very devout-minded individuals when it comes to the concept of friendship with the elves, emulating the elves as much as possible, even in part to it being an unhealthy obsession. This is a weakness that's not present in Gondor proper. Now, you can make the argument, yes, Lothlorien, one of the largest elvish enclaves in western Middle-earth, is just to the north, but it's sufficiently to the north that it's separate. And Galadriel, by design, isolates Lothlorien for a reason. They take no part, after the last alliance, in any kind of politics or machinisms or whatever you want to call it that the humans pursue. They remain in their borders, hidden more or less from the rest of the world, and in some cases even considered a myth to most common humans living in the south and in the Anduin Valley. Thundril's kin and woodland realm to the far north is also quite isolated, but it plays even a lesser role in Gondor's politics. So the Gondorians are more human-minded aspect. They have that drive. While they're still faithful to the cause, they're faithful to the ideal that Elendil sets forth and his followers did back in Numer about being elf friendly. They don't lean on it. They don't absorb it. They don't let it get in the way of this human manifest destiny, this high men destiny. That's not to say that the now Gondorian elite, former Numerians, do not still have that high man ideal, because they do. Their lifespans are 2 or 3 times that of lesser men. They are far more cultured and culturally adept. They are far more learned, educated. They have access to much more advanced knowledge and technology, so to speak, and they utilize this quite a lot in the earlier days of Gondor. You see it in their construction. You see it in their planning for their cities and farms and communities. It's something to take into note. Aside from the occasional seaborne raid, you never, which is a raid, even if it's a raid in force, you never see Umbar or other seagoing enemy come in with sufficient land forces to land and take territory of any size. So aside from the occasional raid from the coast, the lion's share, the heart of Gondor, is secured through most of its history. There are very few incidents where an army rampages through central Lebanon or up into Doranel or into the other areas in between. So you have a very secure population base and agricultural base and industrial base such that it exists for Gondor as a country. This means most, if not all, of the conflict, the fighting, except for the later millennia, takes place on the far frontier or on the borders. It's the most severe fighting goes on within Gondor proper is the Kinstrife, and that is a completely different subject and not part of today's video. So when we look at the faithful who chose to Gondor over Arnor, they did so in some aspects because they had a different mindset. They had a different philosophy as their elders. And then there's no little or no direct elven influence on Gondor like we see in Arnor, because although in Arnor you have Elrod and Rivendell, which is more of an enclave, more of a small outpost or personal settlement of elves around in Rivendell, but not an actual kingdom or country. Not like if you go to Lindon, where we see Gilligad and others who have quite extensive settlements of elves and qualifies as a kingdom like Lothlorien does. But the people of Gondor, the high men of Gondor, are not obsessed with elvish ways, obsessed with elvish philosophy. Because as I say in the video on Arnor, this is a flawed thinking, from a human's perspective. Because I don't care how much you emulate the undying, you're never going to be the undying. You're not immortal. You're never going to be immortal. And having some of that aspect in your head eats at you, even on a small scale. So, this allows the men of Gondor, the high men, to concentrate on world building, on not so much conquering foreign lands, although they do conquer some, but more about robust interaction with other men. And then from this aspect, the fact that they have a far better access to the sea, to the ocean, than Arnor does, also aids in its ability. So Holyger, being the major seaport, is not the only seaport. There's a half dozen or so dozen smaller seaports and sea towns that gain access to the greater trade that goes on in the south and the east. When we look at the west and its influence, it's quite powerful, mostly because of its conflict with Sauron. But there's so much more going on in the world of men to the east and to the south that never etches up against Gondor. Yet Gondor is aware of it and exploits it and embraces it. They conduct trade. They conduct diplomatic forays and military forays in some aspects. We know that in later years they conquer Herod, and they have Herod as a client state for some centuries. They push their northern boundaries to the southern edges of Mirkwood and to the Sea of Rhun, and far west as the borders of the Greyflood and Arnor, although it's very tenuous. The fact that is the mindset. You do not see that mindset in Arnor. And of course, the argument has always been made that, well, Arnor suffered great losses during the War of the Last Alliance, significant losses that they never recovered from that. They're high men and middle Numerian, or low Numerian, depending on how you look at it, male population base was decimated in this war. And it's something to take in note when we talk about the War of the Last Nights. It gets a very brief mention in both the novel and Peter Jackson's movie. It's an important mention, mind you, very important. But we rarely talk about the fact that it lasted 11 years. It wasn't something that happened overnight. This was a decade of war and attrition and fighting. And from my every aspect of the understanding is because Eladel was the king, the High King. His men from Arnor felt the need to be at the forefront of every possible conflict in that 11 years. There's a reason for that attrition. You know, the setback that the woodland elves and Thranduil's elves have was one incident. There was a badly thought out charge led by Thranduil who decimated his woodland elves and caused them to retreat and withdraw more or less from the rest of the war. This did not happen with the other elves that were present, nor take into account or to diminish in any way the sacrifices and the efforts that the elves put forward to fighting Sauron during the War of the Last Alliance. The truth is, men took the brunt of the fighting and the dying on the western side. And in this aspect, Gondor had a far larger population base to pull upon. He also had access to many quote mercenaries, Northmen and some Easterling location people individually who would come and fight for coin or for principal. It also had a much shorter supply base, so those who got hurt and maimed would be sent back to Gondor to recover and recuperate. In some cases, rejoin the fight. Where they would do the same with their brethren from Arnor, the fact that the Arnorians had a much further way to go to get reinforcements, and over time those reinforcements would have trickled down to almost non-existent because they just didn't have the starting population base in Arnor that Gondor enjoyed. There probably was tens of thousands of Numerians alone who had settled in and around Gondor's borders, pre-Gondor. You take it from that perspective. And then there are hordes of Dunlandings and hillmen, or lowmen in some aspects, because a lot of the hillmen's kin who settled in the valleys, river valleys, and the ocean, along the ocean in Gondor proper, no longer were considered hillmen by their relatives, right? But they became middlemen, and they would be in their hundreds of thousands. To suggest that maybe Gondor had a population of several million spread across the area prior to Eladel arriving is not unreasonable. Probably not totally accurate either, but in a short period of time between the formation of Arnor and Gondor and the War of the Last Alliance, this would give them time to establish themselves and begin. But Gondor had a big step up compared to Arnor in this perspective. So we look at that from the perspective of having better, politically speaking and monetary speaking, they have access to a lot more trade, foreign land, human lands, many more human civilizations to the south and the east. That gives them the advantage that Arnor does not have, and would never have the opportunity to really cash in had the War of the Last Alliance not took place. Had Sauron been vanquished and never recovered, to have this conflict, Arnor still would be a backwater, very slowly developed region of Middle Earth, and its riches would have been heavily tied into Gondor proper and the trade that Gondor conducts from around the world. And just my personal opinion on that, right? So when we look at the larger population base, Gondor, the region in and around Gondor, between the White Mountains and the sea, between the Mordor and Anthalos to the west, you're going to have many more cities and far larger population. We've established this. A lot of this was predated before Gondor's established. So Gondor comes in with a large pack and parcel. They didn't have to build from scratch. where in Arnor, pretty much everybody was forced to build from scratch. There was some existing low men, middle men there, but not large numbers. And there were some existing Numerians there, but not in large numbers. Not sufficient numbers to have created a civilization full of cities and road networks and ports and established farmlands and communities like you do see in Gondor proper. This includes the ability of having a larger nobility base. Pretty much the entire nobility base for Arnor came from the faithful, or via the faithful, through the Exodus after the fall of Nimrod. This isn't so in Gondor and Umbar and other places. There are a lot of noble families, or extension of noble families who died off in the fall of Nimrod, who had already established enclaves or summer homes, if you wish, small settlements that they controlled, because that's part and parcel of human nature. And toward the end of Nimrod, that was a very big part of their nature. They were expansion. They were expansionetic. They decided they were going to gain influence in far-flung places. So they went as far east as you can go, and as far south and southeast as you can go, and there's evidence of settlements of Numerians all over the place. And most of them are now considered black Numerians because they're not in league with the faithful and the descendants of the faithful. But the largest contingent of these pre-fall settlers were in and around Gondor. So this gives a large base of people to work with, including a larger nobility base. And it's from the nobility that you get a lot of your commanding officers, your tacticians, your scholars, your sages, because the more it's just typical of that kind of mindset from a Middle Ages kind of belief. The serfs and the low men didn't pursue things of the higher learning or higher positions because they were bent on survival and farming and mining and doing all the other things that a growing Middle Ages type civilization requires. That's not to say it's kind of suggested that in Gondor and in Arnor, even the low men are far more educated and knowledgeable than their distant cousins are in other places. It's just implied, right? So when we look at geography. Gondor being located in a far more temperate location. As I said, it's like a Mediterranean region. They don't suffer great snows. They don't suffer great storms coming up out of the south. What do come up are not totally, not detrimental. I mean, I'm sure they get the occasional hurricane or what passes for one. I'm sure they get some heavy snowfall up in the hills closer to the mountains. But the truth is, it is a much warmer region, like Italy and Greece and areas and Spain, and those areas where you can grow crops year round, and your people don't necessarily suffer from adversity when it comes to the weather as much as you would say far further north. In Arnor, when winter comes, you better have a safe, secure, warm place. You better have made sure that you have enough fuel to keep your fireplace going and your home warm through the winter, or you're going to be in trouble. You better have set enough food aside because your growing season is limited. And outside of that, I'm just saying, right? So it's much more conducive to growth. The climate works to their advantage. And access to the sea, large amounts of access to the ocean. It gives another area for food and resources to be drawn upon. And it's easier to ship things in. If you do have a shortcoming, you have a thin season, you can import stuff because for the large portion of the nobility, the people with the wealth, they're going to have sufficient wealth to purchase goods and foodstuffs and things like this from a distance and have it brought in if need be, and probably do. Right. So the geography works to their advantage. And like I said, most of the Numerians accepted Aradel's claim, and Gondor is fairly rapidly established in sufficient numbers to weather the War of the Last Alliance and come out better off than they were when they went into it. Sufficiently enough so that their on the path of a golden age, which does take some time to occur. In the next odd 1,000 years, from the second age, beginning of the second, or the end of the second age, beginning of the third age, to roughly, I think it's 1100 third age or something like that, when the first of the ship kings show up. I probably should have wrote that date down. We know that there's only one major military issue that Gondor endures, is a major easterly invasion, roughly third age 490, something in there. And they come in large numbers and put a threat, but not sufficient of a threat, because Gondor's armies are pretty potent. Gondor has a standing army to start with. That's unusual for many countries in our own world today, to have the sufficient resources. This is one of the things that made Rome so powerful during its heyday, was the fact that it could have a significant standing army at any given time. They didn't have to waste time calling up reserves or militias, or impressing people into service and then trying to train them and outfit them. They already had standing, well-trained, well-equipped military force that was augmented as needed by auxiliaries and mercenaries and militias and so on and so forth. They didn't have to scramble. And this did occur occasionally because they did have their forces so far out. But the fact is, Gondor was in the same position. And Gondor also maintained a lot of its technology knowledge, its knowledge base that it brought with it from Nuremberg. And they did so because, in part, because they didn't bring a huge pool of library material and teachers and scholars and things like this from the wreck of Normer. No, they were already here. They'd already migrated and settled in Gondor, in the regions around Umbar and other places further south and east, in sufficient numbers to maintain that level of ability and technology and so on and so forth for many decades or centuries to come. So the fact that even into the era of the War of the Ring, Gondor's army, its military people, are very well armored, very well trained. Perhaps not in sufficient numbers, and surely not in the numbers of its heyday coming of the Ship Kings, but still better suited than anybody anywhere else short of the elves. And so we look at this from the prospect of the technology based and access to trade and access to resources. The mountains and the hills in and around Gondor are thick with deposits of silver and iron and tin and nickel, copper. It's all there. Just look at the mentionings of the caves of Argolond, and Helm's Deep. And just gives you a taste of what you can find throughout the White Mountains and surrounding areas. Just giving you that out there. So the wealth's there, the resources, the mineral resources there, the knowledge to utilize these things to their advantage is there. Their construction capabilities are advanced. Now they do diminish over time as the population becomes less Numerian and more middleman, and wars of attrition take their toll. So when we bring ourselves to the middle, because that's towards the other end of a second video, in my opinion, and we'll touch on that briefly. One of the things Gondor endures, Arnor endured as well. Arnor had one chief foe, the Witch King of Angmar, who was a fictitious king of a fictitious kingdom purposely set up with one sole goal: grind Arnor's Numerian population down, the Arnorian Numerians and their followers, grind them down and destroy them. And if he succeeds, it takes a long time to do so. And he succeeds, and the Witch King succeeds in part because the Arnorian nobility helps. I mean, come on, one of the biggest mistakes that the King of Arnor did was when he couldn't decide who would be his successor, and just splits his Arnor into 3 provinces and gives them a piece to each one of his princes. You kidding me? Divide and conquer. Common sense. So what we see here in Gondor is a steady if not frequent, incursions against its borders. Can be attributed to Sauron, as much as everybody wants to say Sauron is the root of all evil in Middle Earth, which is true. But I think there's a lot more going on here. I think that because of the Numerian mindset and their way of handling foreign countries, foreign peoples like the Southrons and the Easterlings and Herodin and all these others is pretty poor. They look down their noses at them. They diminish them. They chastise them. They treat them like dogs in some aspects, in some areas, or as ignorant savages. Sound familiar? That's a Western philosophy that's very badly based. So the same thing. There's a lot of bad blood, a lot of bad feelings in the East and the South. All plenty of reasons to keep coming and pressing Gondor to the West. You don't take a lot. It wouldn't take a lot for Sauron to encourage some of these people to march on Gondor, especially if they think Gondor's got a problem or it's having issues. So Gondor has these constant, pretty much every generation has some kind of invasion. And for the earlier days, they push them back and they succeed in defeating these waves after waves and push their boundaries further out. This is on purpose. This is to, encourage and or to keep the fighting as far away from Gondor proper. And there's good reasons for this, right? I mean, you can look at the expansion and other things that are going on here. Okay, So like I said, Gondor expands, pushes its borders back. It sets a watch on Mordor after the success of the War of the Last Alliance. Sauron's defeated. He's diminished. Gondor's defending the West and protecting the world supposedly from Sauron resuming and other nefarious individuals getting access to whatever was left over from Sauron's military machine, and so on and so forth in Mordor proper. Mordor itself, as we all know, is not suitable for any kind of settlement of humans. Mining elements and things like that, even that's questionable. And there's still going to be a lot of evil things. Orcs and goblins and evil creatures and nasty things and spiders and all have giant spider, what have you, that's going to infest Mordor itself. So Gondor builds a series of fortifications. The Towers of the Teeth, for example, that protect the entrance to the Morannon. The tower that's built, Cirith Ungol, that's built there to protect the back entrance, which was all built by and manned by Gondor for many centuries. Up until the end of the Kinstry, things start to change. That's not, like I said, part of this video. That would be why Arnor doesn't do so hot. The Sea Kings, the military. This is what we're talking about at this point. Gondor's power to extend its military influence at a distance is at its peak. This is where we come into a era of what's called the Ship Kings. There's 4 kings: Balastar, Ernel, Ciriadil, and Harmakardel. And I'll tell you right now, yes, I can't pronounce these damn words to save my soul. So comment all you want. But the fact is, just because you cannot pronounce something and maybe can't spell something properly does not mean you don't know what they are and who they are and how they should sound in your head. And keep in mind, from a dialect and from a distance, we all pronounce things slightly different. Just so you say. Yeah, and I get a little cheese every now and then. I should. Okay. So, yeah, I guess it was Third Age 1149, which was when was the death of the last Ship King, although the actual decline takes many, many years. And then the 3 great things that will follow, of course, is the Kinstrike, the Great Plague, and then the Line of the Kings fail. And this is where the real change in Gondor takes place. But this takes place almost 1,000 years after the fall of the Sea Kings. So they say that the Golden Age ends with the Sea Kings. And that may be true. My morning Pepsi. So, that's a matter of conjecture and opinion. How you look at it. The fact is, at this point, up to 1150, Third age. Gondor's military, its sea power is extended to its peak. There are no known forces individually in the world that can take on Gondor one on one. Gondor even sends at the end of the day, Gondor even sends an army to the north to Arnor to try to secure Arthedain and what's left of Arnor from the Witch King, but they arrive too late. Too little, too little, too late. But they arrived in sufficient numbers to crush Angmar's army and pretty much send the Witch King packing. At that point, the Witch King's actually achieved his goal, although all but the most devout scholars would have understood that the lion's share of the people figured because Gondor arrived with the help of the elves, crushed Angmar and out of existence, which is not true. Yes, it's true that they defeated the Angmar's army at the time, but there was no further need for Angmar as a country. Its purpose was served. It was a political, power-based thing. It had nothing to do with actual wanting to control territory. Because let's be honest, that is a very harsh and nasty region to try to have a successful, large country of any sort. So the Witch King achieved his goals, even if at the very end he's cheated of what he would have considered his ultimate victory, which he then immediately goes south and takes Minas Ithil away from Gondor and turns it into Minas Morgul, and then eventually suckers the last actual king of Gondor to come in to challenge him on a one-on-one basis, which is absurd. And in that aspect, you got what you deserved. I hate to say it, but I look at that from even today's perspective, considering how bad things are and how things are not so well handled. If you're not willing to get up and stand up against it, if you're not willing to cast your vote for change and mean it, then you get what you deserve. The rest of us just get hosed over all the time. But that's another thing for another video, which we're not here. So the reason Gondor is successful, in part, is because it already had a huge step up. Let's run down the numbers one last time. When the faithful arrive, the Numerians are established in and around Gondor's region before the area that would become Gondor in large numbers. They already have a large middleman base here as well, in large numbers. There's no real kingdoms, but there's these little, baronies or things like this, if you will, or little city-states or things like this. Now, Pale is a significantly large city before Gondor is even established. And then later, the population is so large that Gondor is able to establish about a dozen significant towns and 4 or 5 significant cities. Easily 3 to 5 times more than what Arnor had at its height. And then its population continues to grow. So there's a large enough number of pure-blooded Numerian bloodline for the high men to continue intermarrying amongst their own and keeping their bloodlines as pure as possible, like the Numerians did in Arnor, with a much smaller base, and eventually cost them. The fact that they lost so much of their bloodlines, their men in the War of the Last Alliance, in that 11 years of conflict, that it basically was a nail in the coffin for the country, as opposed to Gondor, who had probably 10 times the Numerian bloodline to work from, and the Numerian lesser men. Because a whole lot of these Numerians had no problems in some aspects of propagating with lesser humans in their mindsets. Although later, especially in nobility, this is typical of that noble or that purist mindset that leads to the kinstripe. So we know it's well established in Gondor because the kinstripe occurs because of it. But there's huge population numbers. And then we have the climate, the geography. Gondor is well suited to be a civilization, and a very active one, because it can produce food 365 days a year. They have access to food supplies, and then they have the ocean, a large base of materials and foodstuffs that come from the ocean directly and from ocean-going trade. They might be as far west as most eastern and southern trading outfits might want to pursue, but they don't need to go any further west. This is one of the reasons, another reason for Arnor having problems in the aspects of trade, because Gondor sits on the major trade routes and is the end point for most of that trade. So most of Arnor's trade would have been between Arnor and Gondor proper. So I'm just saying, right? And then you add the access to the other way around. Gondor's fleets are much larger than Arnor's and range much further afield and produce and bring in much more wealth. And then we have access to larger managed contingents to the east, to the south, and to the north. Arnor is isolated behind the Misty Mountains and all that entails, with the Icelands to the north, vast Dunlin and Hillman haunted territories to the south, mostly desolate lands because nobody's really truly settled there in sufficient numbers, and the elves to the west who don't really need much from, if anything, from the humans. Where Gondor has access to the Anduin Valley, the Northman settlements to the north, as far north as northern Mirkwood and Lake Town, and to the places east, the Sea of Run, and further places east. They have access to the dwarves in Moria and at the Lonely Mountain. They have access to what limited elf access they need, which is very little. But they have Lothlorien, they have Thunderl's elves they can trade with. They also have, like I said, gobs and gobs of humans and human civilizations to the east and south, both as a conflict and as for trade, because that's how that would play out. We don't have conflict 24/7. We have conflict that comes and goes every generation or two, and some major invasions every few hundred years. But in between, there's going to be a lot of trade, a lot of money passing over, and wealth passing hands, and so on and so forth. We have access to a lot of this stuff. We also have large mineral bases in the White Mountains. The White Mountains themselves are a great barrier from northern invasions. The invasions that do occur, for the most part, do not enter Gondor proper. They come, it's not until later centuries does the fighting actually take place on the Anduin near Osgiliath. Most of this fighting takes way south in Harador, the southern provinces of Gondor and Harad, and in the north and to the northeast on the Great Plains there near Rune, and east of the Misty Mountains and east of Mirkwood and north of Mordor. So, and most of those conflicts stay there. Gondor marches to them and engages in conflict there, instead of waiting for it to come to their borders until many, 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 many centuries later, when they've really diminished as a power. But in the central period of time, that's not going to happen. So that the height of their power, which is what we're looking here, Gondor can send great fleets to the east and to the south at will. They keep in check, and for a brief number of time, and for a couple times, they actually conquered Umbar and take over and eliminate the issue from the Corsairs for some centuries. And the Dunlandings and the descendants of the Hillmen and so on and so forth that fled to the west, excuse me. Well, they're also sufficiently not in enough numbers to take Gondor on directly. Gondor builds a series of beacon towers and beacon sites along both sides of the White Mountains. And it's mentioned in the books, not so much in the movies, other than the beacons of the north, but there are beacons in the south as well. This allows the far-flung edges of Gondor's provinces to the west on either side of the mountains to stay in contact with the heart and soul of the country and request assistance. So, and then you have the powers of the Plantier up until the latter years of Gondor's and Arnor's decline. But in the heart of this time right now, the Plantier are still in control, or the High Men are still in control of their Plantier, and through this and their sages are able to see and to oversee and to observe a lot, right? That's another thing that makes me wonder. We see very little concept of magic, but there's implications that there was magic at the height of Gondor. Gondor had some possession of abilities other than the Plantier, but that's a completely different thing and not related to this. So there you have it. why Gondor succeeded up until the end of the Sea Kings. They still succeeded because the Gondor was, at the end of the day, and I beg you to challenge me on this. Aragon inherits a country, while much diminished, much more tarnished than what it would have been 1,000 years earlier. Is still potent, still capable, still fairly well off and fairly well protected. Things were dire toward the end there, but there was a series of reasons for that. It wasn't any one particular thing, but there was a number of things that worked in conjunction, and not just Sauron and his influence. But the fact was, Gondor was still sufficiently capable of defending itself from a vastly superior force. And with timely aid from several sources, were able to defeat that issue. Now, the argument can be made that, well, if it wasn't for if Frodo hadn't destroyed the One Ring, that's true. But keep in mind, the Battle of Pelennor was successfully won by men and their their allies, by Gondor and her allies, Rohan, and because of a timely intervention of the future king and his resources of an undead army. So, even when vastly outnumbered and woefully short on morale at that point, Gondor still rallies and defeats Sauron's force. Enough so that it keeps pushing them back to the point where they can march on the gate of Morannon. Well, that was a suicidal attack, you would say. That is true, but we all know that Aragorn leading the free forces of the West to the Morannon, to the gate, Black Gates, to challenge Sauron's force at his front doorstep, was not about power projection. And that's another discussion for another day. So, this is Rick. Hope you have a great weekend.